tonight's webinar, First Steps in Leading Change. Again, my name is Miguel Escobar, and I serve as a Managing Program Director for Leadership, Resources, and Communications here at the Episcopal Church Foundation. And we want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy weeks, especially this week, Thanksgiving week, and busy schedules to attend tonight's event. People from church joining us. And what we've asked is that if you could just type in where you are joining us from into your chat box, into the chat box on the lower right-hand corner. You'll see that folks have described where they're coming from tonight. So before we begin, just a few notes about the technical side of leading a webinar. One thing is that as people sign on, oftentimes we get some background noise, and in order to continue with the presentation, we may need to mute folks just to limit that noise. So if you get a "you've been muted" message, know that that's the reason why. We gave some instructions for how to turn on your webcam. Again, turning on your webcam is completely optional. But the basic process is to press the Start My Webcam button, which is kind of above in the upper right-hand corner, just above where the PowerPoint is, and press the button Start Sharing. If you have questions, we invite you to type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. Throughout this presentation in particular, there are going to be opportunities for discussion, and so if you have your microphone enabled or if you're calling over the phone, you can also speak. The simplest way is sometimes the chat box as well. PDFs of the slides and our resource list are available for download, and I'm going to show you where those are. The slides are just to the left of where the green arrow is now, and there's a resource list if you want to learn more about leading change resources available on ECF Vital Practices. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made public at a later point, so it's a teaching tool that people will be able to view at a later point in time. So that's just something for all of us to bear in mind. Finally, just a few words about what the Episcopal Church Foundation is. We are an independent, lay-led organization founded in 1949. Our mission is to strengthen congregations through vision and planning, leadership development, and raising financial resources for ministry. We do this in a variety of ways, and one of the most important of which is by doing what we're doing tonight, which is we offer free online education and discussions on a wide variety of leadership and financial topics. And we hope that these will help you to build healthy, vital, and vibrant Episcopal communities of faith. And finally, as our opening, let's just begin with prayer. So if we could just take a moment to pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking, as he did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So today we're looking at different elements of leading change that anyone who is leading a change process needs to bear in mind. And it's a five-part presentation. The first, we're going to ask, where is this change coming from? You know, there is some change that is unilaterally led, and there is some change that comes from the grassroots community, and then there's a lot of different types of change that are sort of somewhere in between. And most of us are going to be operating in somewhere between between those two extremes. Then we're going to focus on what many leading change experts describe as, the first 3 steps of leading change, which is discerning a shared and hopeful vision of what this change would look like once it's implemented in your congregation, building a team to lead this process, and then sustaining a sense of urgency about the need for this change over the long haul. Finally, we're going to wrap it all up with some potential next steps, and that is just going to be an opportunity for discussion. But throughout the presentation, we're also going to have multiple opportunities for discussion. And again, for those who have just joined, I would just welcome all of you to please do offer your comments and questions as you try to apply these, what are ultimately pretty big ideas and concepts, to your particular situation. So let's begin with asking where this change is coming from. Just a moment ago, we had participants write into the chat box a few examples of what the kind of change that's happening in their congregation. As you can see that there are some changes that are going to need to be led by one individual, almost kind of unilateral change, and then there's going to be changes that are led from the entire community. Just to give an example of a change that's being led from the entire community, Lynette mentioned that there is a clergy transition happening at our congregation. That is a need that's very present, and it's going to be obvious as the clergy person retires and moves on. That's sort of an externally induced change. Some other changes might come about as a result of a clergy person wanting to make a significant change in worship style. That can be either a unilateral or a consensus or a change that's done in combination with the community. One of the distinctions that I want to make here is just the difference between the authority to make a change and the process of actually leading change. Different people in congregations have the authority to make changes. So for instance, the rector has certain authority to make unilateral changes around worship and music, and the vestry has authority to make changes around property and finance. But that authority is a little bit different than the process of leading change, in so much as leading change generally involves some form of consensus building and some form of checking in with the wider community and some form of creating opportunities for feedback, even in instances where an individual or a small group has the full authority to make a change. I want to this is a really important concept, so I just want to check in and ask, does this make sense, what I just described? And if you could just type into the chat box whether that's clear or not. Okay. Great. It's a really important concept just for all of us to bear in mind as we continue with this presentation. An approach that values more collaborative leadership is going to be, unfortunately, it's going to be a little slower There's gonna need to be more emphasis placed on building consensus. Sometimes it's going to feel very unclear. There's going to be, 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And one rector who I spoke with about a year ago, she's a rector of a very vibrant parish in Connecticut, though it wasn't so 10 years ago when she started, described this process as largely awareness building. The congregation that she was at was the physical plant was in disrepair, so much so that the floor of where they met in coffee hour had a huge crack in it. And so over the course of a year, what she would do is she would stand over the crack as people during coffee hour, and as people came up and spoke with her, she would just periodically say, "Wow, look at this giant crack in our floor. And isn't this strange that we have a giant crack in our floor? And gee, maybe we should do something about this crack in the floor." And that was her practice. She did that for a year, and then finally, at the vestry meeting, someone started saying, "There's this giant crack in the floor, and maybe we should do something about that." So she was leading change, but her first step there was simply awareness building around the need to do that. So, there's Lynette again. Your example of a clergy transition. There's an obvious need that you're working with, but there are other examples that were given, like the need to get a congregation to be more missionally focused. That may not be as immediately apparent to people. So there's going to just need to be, at the first step, a lot of awareness building within the community around the need for this change. So I gave a range of different kind of questions around where this change is coming from. The one end, the unilateral, and then one end, the completely consensus-driven approach. But sometimes a change is appropriate there's an appropriate time for unilateral change. And just to answer my question, the first question, because I'm aware of time, an instance of unilateral change is, for instance, when the rector comes across something that appears criminal. There have to be immediate changes in what is taking place, and there's not time to really check in with the broader community about this. So that's a time in which obviously unilateral change makes sense, and leaning on that authority is really important. But there are other times when there might be authority to make a unilateral change, when it would nevertheless be best to work toward consensus. And I'm wondering if anyone in the group can think of an instance where that might be the case. Thank you, Richard. Yes. That is the classic example of a moment in which you may have the authority to make this change, but really, worship is owned, or at least felt to be owned, by the wider community, and it really needs to be a time in which you hear from the wider community. And Don, yes, exactly. That's another example. So the next few steps we wanted to talk about are really oftentimes what's called the first steps in leading change. And there are change management experts who will list these in different orders, but one of the things we've noticed is that these 3 are pretty consistently in the top 4 or 5 steps, and we've decided that this is the order that we can best present them, at least. The first is to build a hopeful vision around the need for change. And then we'll go on from there. In terms of building a hopeful vision, oftentimes in the Episcopal Church we use the word discerning to discern a hopeful vision. And sometimes I feel like it's one of our more overused words in the Episcopal Church. So in those moments, I think it's helpful to remember that the etymology or the root of discernment is actually the verb to sift. So sifting for a hopeful vision. This is especially important in change processes because when we gather as a group to talk about the need for a change, especially if it's a change that has been needed for quite some time, there may be a lot of stuff that comes up in those initial conversations. And some of that stuff may not be always very positive. So for instance, if the congregation is contemplating a change in music style, some of the initial conversations around why there needs to be a change in music style may be rooted in dissatisfaction with the current music style that's happening at worship. It's really important to just, first of all, acknowledge that and say, well, this is really important stuff, but what we're doing here is we're sifting for the most hopeful version of why we are doing this change. It's like finding a gem in the midst of all the stuff that comes up. And that's what a vision is. A vision is a hopeful picture of the future that describes what things will be like when this change has been accomplished. As simple as it may sound, this hopeful vision is one of the most important tools that you will have to hold on to as you go through this process. John Cotter, who kind of wrote the book, or at least the classic book on leading change processes, notes that vision plays a key role in directing, aligning, and inspiring actions on the part of large numbers of people, basically over the long haul. So again, taking time to find the most hopeful version of why you are leading this change and of what this change would look like in your congregation is really worth it. And he notes that a strong vision of change is imaginable, hopeful, feasible, focused, flexible, and communicable. And all of that is to say that there are some images of change, some visions that aren't those things. And I've given two examples on the page, two sort of images on the page, the first of which is an example in which that didn't quite work out. You'll see the 29% here. This is an example from, I guess, the business world, so please bear with me. But it's a good example, I think, of a vision gone awry. In the early years of 2000, General Motors set a vision for themselves of recapturing 29% of the market share. And they made like giant posters, and executives wore lapel pins that said 29%. And they tried to organize everyone around this number. It was a good try, but it wasn't necessarily feasible, and it certainly wasn't flexible. And in the end, it actually hurt many efforts because in order to reach that number, people started cutting corners in a variety of ways, and it actually ended up hurting the organization as a whole. So this is kind of a classic case study for something called for a paper called Goals Gone Wild. And if you want to learn more, I would encourage you. You can find the paper online. In contrast, the image here of of hands working together. This is an image from actually an Episcopal church in Minnesota. It's a stained glass image. And I think it really captures what might be a more imaginable, hopeful, and feasible type of vision for how a community might work together. So let's say a vestry decides over the course of the next year that they want to set as their goal working together in really fruitful ways. This image sort of captures it, and it's flexible enough to allow people to imagine a variety of different strategies for actually achieving it. So when you're thinking about your hopeful vision, again, the question is there going to be enough flexibility within it for you to try out a lot of different ways, as opposed to being confined by it in the long run? So just a few questions. I'm wondering if you can think of an example of a vision of change that's rooted in negativity, something that a not so successful quote unquote vision of change. Yes, thank you, Richard. That is exactly the one I'm most familiar with. Oftentimes during annual stewardship campaigns, you will hear, or rather, an effort to build a culture of stewardship within a congregation is the reason might originally be, well, if we don't have more money, we can't turn on the lights. Well, that may be true, or we can't keep the lights on. That might be true, but it's not going to be the vision that inspires and sort of grabs hold of the congregation over the long haul. What's another? Okay, yep. Hard for us, yep. Just to use, I think, an example that Richard mentioned earlier is, a congregation, many congregations have become, let's say, disconnected from their wider neighborhood. There are many ways of presenting that and the need for change to the community. The positive version would be, let's imagine what it would look like if we were more connected to our neighborhood, versus the sort of shaming approach, which is we don't look like our neighborhood, and therefore we need to change. Speaking of that, and I'll go back to the comments in just a moment. I want to give an example of a vision for change in an Episcopal congregation that worked really well. This comes from St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, Ohio, and the rector there is David Bargetzi. If you'd like to learn more about how they did this process, I'd encourage you to reach out to him. He was very generous in offering us this example. St. Luke's is a congregation in inner city Cleveland, and in 2000, the congregation was in a place that many Episcopal churches find themselves in, which is that their membership looked nothing like the neighborhood that surrounded it, just like what I was talking about. And one of the reasons that David was hired was in order to change that. So the change was clearly defined. There was some sense of urgency around the need for this change. So what they did was they began with doing some needs assessment in the neighborhood. And over time, that process led them to a vision of what the church would be like and how it would operate for them to be how it would need to operate for them to become truly a neighborhood church. So the vision that they set forth in this example was to become a neighborhood church. So it's a positive vision. It's flexible. It communicated lots of different things to current parishioners. But what I really liked about what St. Luke's did was that David then took this to the next level and asked different groups within the church, so everyone from the altar guild to the coffee hour people, volunteers, to imagine what would it mean like for your particular committee if we became the neighborhood church. So an example of how this led to really good conversations was the coffee hour volunteers had to ask themselves, what happens when a newcomer who is from the neighborhood wants to bring their food into our coffee hour that we've been organizing for the past 30 years, And it didn't take much, but it just took that conversation for them to realize in order to become a neighborhood church, we have to open ourselves to that possibility. And we have to be welcoming when they bring food that doesn't look like the food that we currently prepare. So it's a really interesting example, I think, of how St. Luke's took this vision and slowly had conversations around it to then implement it within the community. And this is St. Luke's now, which looks a lot more like the neighborhood that surrounds it. So we've asked so far where change is coming from and tried to think of ways to get more people involved in this process. We've also tried to figure out how to have a more positive vision of the reason for change and how that will look, how that will ultimately impact the life of the congregation. Now we're going on to the question of who's going to actually lead this process. And our hope is that you will find a strong team to help lead this change so that it's not just you or just a few folks leading this process alone. And in creating a team, what we wanted to do is offer a tool from Interaction Associates. So I'm holding up the big binder of this leadership training organization. They're a really great organization, and their work, this entire binder is all about facilitative leadership, so collaborative leadership. And one of the most important tools that they offer in there is what I'm showing you right now, which is basically a stakeholder analysis tool. On the left-hand side, you see there are 4 categories of stakeholders: those ultimately responsible for decisions, those who implement or prevent the implementation of this change, those who will be directly affected by the outcome, and those who have information and expertise. So when you're thinking about leading change, it may be a good practice to, in fact, I think it's a good practice to spend some time naming the 4 different categories here. And let's just focus on the middle column as an example now. So let's say, like many congregations, your congregation would like to build its annual operating budget through a variety of stewardship efforts. Well, there are a few people who you have to get on board with this. Certainly the vestry and the clergy person, if this isn't the person who's leading it, as well as ultimately the stewardship committee. If you don't have these critical groups, you're not going to get very far. You need to, let's skip number 2 for the moment, category 2, and go to those directly affected by the outcome. At some point, you're going to have to engage those who will be affected by this decision, all members of the congregation, especially those who are already giving generously of their gifts and who you may be asking to give more. There may be experts within your community who can offer information about how to do this process more effectively, and you certainly want to have them involved in the process. And then lastly, but perhaps even most importantly, you're going to need to get on board those who will implement this change, which are members of the stewardship committee, staff, volunteers. These are the people who are going to put in the hours to make this change a reality. We're going to go back to this in just a moment. And I want to actually ask for a volunteer to go through and name some of the stakeholder categories. But before that, what I'd like to do is just give an example of a time in which a great idea didn't really work out because we forgot one of the key stakeholders. And this, incidentally, is not uncommon. Actually, many change processes get tripped up because they forget the stakeholder category number 2, which is those who implement or can prevent implementation. So this congregation shall go nameless, but let's just say a congregation I'm familiar with wanted to make a broader effort to be more hospitable to visitors. Like many congregations, it wanted to grow. And so the rector had a really good idea, and I still hold that it's a great idea, to change the location of the coffee hour from the dank basement to the back of the sanctuary. They had removed some pews in the back to make space for tables, and the truth is that people weren't going to the dank basement coffee hour where community was built. And so they wanted to make a more accessible and easy to find place where to hold coffee hour. The rector, who was new, had some great leadership skills already. And so he made sure to get approval from the vestry. He even announced the change to the congregation and why. And he had actually read about this idea outside, in an article, and so was kind of drawing on the expertise of another community leader. But he forgot to notify or forgot to ask the input of the volunteers who had been setting up and taking down a coffee hour for the past 20 or 30 years. And as a result, the coffee hour folks were very unhappy. They felt that they had been forgotten by their church, and in some real way they had been. And so suddenly the congregation had no more volunteers for coffee hour. And needless to say, this idea didn't go any further as a result. So it's really important to just take a moment and think about who needs to be involved in these conversations, and hopefully the tool that I showed you is one way of doing that. So let me move here. Um, and I'm wondering if I can have a volunteer. Um, and maybe someone whose microphone is turned on or who is willing to call in. Um, would anyone like to volunteer to do sort of an example stakeholder analysis with us?
I'm happy to do it. This is Richard in Vancouver.
Thank you, Richard.
Let the Canadian
Okay.
do it.
Yeah, let's let the Canadian do it. That's right. All right. If I'm remembering correctly, the change that you're leading is trying to get the congregation to be a little bit more missionally involved and connected to the neighborhood. Is that right?
That's correct.
Great. So in the first category, who do you see as ultimately responsible for kind of giving the green light on this idea or not?
In our structure, it would be the rector and what we call the church committee, what you in the States call the vestry, we call church committee or parish council here. So they would be the primary people to say we need to move in a particular direction.
Great, great. Let's skip to the third category.
Mhm.
Who's going to be directly affected by this?
Actually, every member of the congregation, because the minute you begin to invite new people and actually have them come, everything changes. I lived through the ordination of women, was ordained in 1981, so just 5 years before, 5 years after. So one of the realizations was that when you have women in ordained leadership, the church does in fact change. You can't pretend that there aren't going to be changes. So the same thing is true when a church begins to reach out to its neighborhood. The minute you have new people, I loved your example of they'll start bringing their food, and that's not our stuff. So it does make a significant change. So everyone is affected by it.
I would add another group to
Hmm.
this same category, which is the neighborhood.
Hmm.
If there are people, community leaders within the neighborhood, that they would be directly affected by your kind of opening up uh, goal.
Fair enough. True.
Yeah. On the fourth category, do you know if there are people in the congregation or in the neighborhood actually as well who might have critical information or expertise that would help you in this process?
Mm. Um, Actually, within the congregation, we have um, a person who works for what's called the Immigrant Services Society here in Metro Vancouver. So she's very aware of the demographic changes in neighborhoods and what are some of the concerns that they have. We also
Great.
have several members of the congregation who are great at one-on-one invitations. They're not afraid to invite people. Um, and Fortunately, within the diocese, we have a fair number of people who have expertise with the changing cultural and ethnic communities that are making up Metro Vancouver.
Wonderful. Great. And then the last category, those who'd implement or prevent implementation. Are there key staff, key volunteers who you need to be in touch with? Are there, I think the term is, the pillars of the church, the lay pillars of the church who need to be on board?
Yeah. Um, most of the most of the ones who would prevent implementation have in recent years become homebound. And so they become something for me as a pastoral minister, I go visit them. So they're not going to prevent implementation. The people who I think are most uh, at the at the gateway are the greeters in our parish, the people who are at the doors on Sundays, who, with the way they look, the way they speak, the way they act, they can either truly welcome someone in the door or say to them, "Why are you here? This isn't your place."
Right.
So the greeters, those kind of folks, I think are the most active implementers of a change in the vision.
Great. Well, thank you so much for volunteering. I hope this is a good example for others of, just how simply even taking, 5 to 10 minutes to speak aloud this process kind of comes up with a different list than you might initially have begun with.
And if I
And then
might,
there's,
Miguel, it's very
go
helpful
ahead.
when you do that in conversation with someone. So talking about it with you, you were able to add the bit about where was it? The neighborhood itself, the leaders, the neighborhood changes. So speaking it out loud with someone else to reflect on is helpful.
Yes, very much so. And in fact, whenever, oops, wrong one. Uh, In fact, here at DCF, when we have periodically led a major change in a program, um, in our when we've done it in the best possible way, we've actually gathered as a group and talked out each of these 4 categories,
Hmm.
and then had a conversation about, well, who needs to be then contacted and who needs to be involved in what order to make this a successful process. Great. So the last thing I wanted to just speak about was a sense of urgency around the need for change. I'm going to go back here to this slide. This is further than, okay, this slide, which again just talked about basically the slow, um, sometimes unclear process of leading change. There's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Um, there's a lot of awareness building and consensus building. It's it's something that takes a lot of time to do well, and because of that, um, because of that, there is, after the sort of initial excitement of we're going to after the initial excitement or the announcement, um, there's oftentimes a lag or some inertia settles in. And this last piece has to do with how do you sustain a sense of urgency around the need for change over the long haul. And especially as those people who are facilitating this process for change, um, we need to have a few things in our back pocket. The first of which is just a sense of awareness. Uh, the, and this awareness has to do with the power of inertia. Um, Again, going back to John Cotter's work on leading change, he actually puts as his number one rule, the number one thing that everyone who's leading change needs to bear in mind is to not underestimate the power of inertia. Um, all of us actually none of us like change. And even whenever we've all said we are excited about becoming a neighborhood church, or we are excited about having a new clergy person as a result of this clergy transition, after a little while, some of that's going to ebb and flow, and inertia starts to set in. And there are lots of reasons for inertia. There's not a visible crisis. Things are going along, and it's fine. Um, there are lots of symbols that seem to convey that everything is fine. Um, there are lots of messages from leaders saying that we don't really actually need to change. So what he suggests is that we need to have in our back pocket just some tools for how to increase a sense of urgency, not necessarily anxiety, but a sense of urgency around the need for change. Leaders need to be very frank at times about the problems that this change is trying to address. Even though we may have a hopeful vision, we want to have the primary message being a hopeful vision. We also need to, be frank about why and some of the aspects that are causing this. There are missed opportunities. We want to, I think the language in the third bullet point is probably wrong, allow a crisis to loom large. That's probably the wrong term, but maybe just not necessarily whitewash some of the problems that we see that are resulting from a lack of change. So in other words, overall, we as change leaders need to become more comfortable with inserting a sense of urgency around change. That is not necessarily easy. And in fact, many of us who have gone to seminary or been in Fresh Start or been in other leadership settings have learned that leadership has to do with being a non-anxious presence in sort of all settings, all times. And that is important and wonderful. But leading change also means injecting a sense of urgency at times about the need for change. And so one of the questions I have, and it's not a rhetorical question, it's truly a question for myself, is how can someone be a non-anxious presence while also being very honest with your constituency, with your community, about the need for change? And I'd love to hear any thoughts or feedback that you would have about what are some good ways of doing that. Or what is a way that you have done that? Yep. Identify the options before us and the consequences of not acting. One of the best ways that I found, not in a congregation, but here at ECF and working with a team of folks, it's a team of 7 people, with our programs, is to talk about missed opportunities. It's not necessarily, it's not so much, the reason being that it's not always negative to say that, it's actually positive to sometimes say, there was this opportunity that came across, and had we thought about it or had we done X, Y, Z, we would have been able to take advantage of it. We didn't in this instance, and it spurs a conversation about how we might be more able and more ready to do that in the future. Brendan, did you have
yeah, I would say like one congregational example I can share is many of us can remember back to 2008 roughly with the financial crisis. And in the years, immediate months and years following that, on the congregation staff, we really made, the congregation was amazing in stepping up to keep things going as best we could in terms of giving, in terms of participation, despite all of the hardships some people faced. And we as a staff also really pushed hard to make sure that we did not change up anything, to be honest, to be able to be able to sort of, we felt like we needed to shield the congregation from some of the budget constraints that we were facing, which were very lean and tough times. And at one point, we actually did realize that we had perhaps had a missed opportunity to really discuss some of the things that maybe we should have been really trying to cut back on, and the fact that we were really stretching our staff resources, not just in terms of dollars, but also in terms of time and capacity. And so we had to kind of take a step back to some extent and be able to look forward towards how were we going to move forward with the idea that things are going to improve and we'd be able to return to that. So that's just one experience I had in ministry with that sort of missed opportunity.
And I would thank you for that example, because I think that this is a good description of one of these that's a little bit harder. If you see, there's one of the bullet points: evaluate whether symbols are conveying that everything is fine. Symbols and people are conveying that everything is fine. It sounds as if maybe the staff, in taking seriously its efforts to shield the congregation from the real financial crisis that was happening within the congregation, almost did its job too well, and wasn't necessarily being forthright with the community about how difficult and how challenging the situation was as you try to stretch dollars in sort of impossible ways. And that there's some value to that. Obviously there's some value to not allowing all the anxiety to be shifted to the congregation. But there is a little bit of a missed opportunity for some very frank conversations with the wider community about the realities of the financial crisis and how it's impacting the congregation and the staff in particular. So somewhere between, it sounds like there needs to be a way of being forthright while also being non-anxious. Okay, well, wrapping up, here are just a few thoughts on next steps. And these are basically a summary of everything we've already talked about this. First is, again, evaluate where this change is coming from. Is it coming from one person? Is it coming from just two people? Are there ways in which you can build more consensus in your community around the need for this change? Secondly, when starting to have conversations around the need for change, there's going to be a lot of stuff, or very often there's a lot of stuff that comes up. This is an opportunity to sift amidst all of that for the most hopeful version, the most hopeful vision of change, of what the church or world would look like once this change has taken place. And communicate that need for change on a regular basis. We offered a tool on stakeholders to do a stakeholder analysis, and Richard's point I thought was really great, which is to take the time to do that with your team or with others. Who's ultimately responsible? Who's going to be potentially implementing or preventing implementation? Who's going to be directly affected? Who's going to have expertise to help along this process? That's there needs to be a time in which you build a team to help lead this, and that's a really great group of people to pull from. Lastly, pay attention to the fact that leading change over the long haul is very difficult, and there's a lot of inertia that can set in. so we want to have in our back pockets just a few tools for how to generate more urgency over the long haul in this process. And I think that concludes our content. Any final comments or questions that you'd like to ask about all this? Nope. Okay. Was this? Can I ask if this was helpful for you?
For me, it was helpful, Miguel, because here in the diocese we have a diocesan school for congregational development, and so in this last hour, you've offered a very helpful picture of the change process, and I found it quite reinforcing for some of the other work that I'm doing. I and others are doing in the diocese as part of our school for congregational development.
Great. Thrilled to hear that. Well, I want to show lastly just a screenshot. Let me go here. Of just upcoming webinars that we have. At the very top, obviously, is tonight's webinar. But over the course of the next month or so, we're going to be doing, ECF will be doing webinars on making a planned gift to your parish. There's a Spanish language webinar. If any of you are familiar with perhaps English, Spanish, or bilingual congregations, there will be a Spanish language webinar on stewardship, on the particular challenges of doing stewardship in Spanish-speaking congregations. On December 10th, there will be a webinar on Team Leadership Essentials, so how do you build a functioning team? And then on December 15th, one of our fellows is going to be focusing on Chinese ministry in the Episcopal Church. This is Thomas Wei-Lang Ni. He is in the Diocese of Los Angeles and is the executive director of the Florence Lee Pimoy Center. One of the things that many people do not know about the Episcopal Church is that one of the fastest growing segments of the Episcopal Church is Latinos and Asian Americans. And so Thomas is going to be speaking a little bit about Chinese, in particular Mandarin, ministries in the Episcopal Church. So we invite everyone who's interested to join on that evening. Finally, just a few moments, you should be receiving a survey on tonight's webinar. Again, please take a moment to fill out the webinar. We're always trying to improve them. Just let us know. And again, we hope to see you in the future for another webinar. Brendan, did I forget anything?
Nope, got everything.
Okay, great. Great. Well, have a lovely evening, everyone, and a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you south of the border.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.